Hi, I'm Mary Elizabeth Williams, and this is Matthew Rozsa. He is currently at Democracy at Work. He's also writing a book called Neurosocialism, which the title alone, you've got me. And he authors the column Backseat Socialism. He is a very amazing and well-regarded writer. He is a former colleague of mine, and he is also my friend. Hi, Matt. How are you?
Hi, Mary Elizabeth. I'm doing great. Thank you for saying so many nice things about me.
All truth. Matt, I want to start with the question that is to me the heart and soul of patient. What was the healthcare experience that radicalized you?
I would say it was the accumulation of experiences in which I felt that outcomes depended on finance, to be blunt. That I found patients who received better care were generally those who had more money. To use a personal experience, one that actually occurred when you and I were colleagues at Salon Magazine, I took some time off to go to rehab. And while I was there, I was fortunate that my insurance allowed me to stay for just as long as I needed, and then I could leave. But there were patients who were forced out because their insurance premiums kicked them to the curb. I would then contrast this with people I know who have money and need rehab, but don't seek care. And the contrast in both privilege and outcome galled me. It helped me understand that even though there are some among us who have access to these resources and take it for granted, there are others who desperately wish they could just have 30 to 90 days in a clinic to dry out, sober up, figure out how to get their lives together. And simply because they don't have enough money, they can't. More often than not, they don't have enough money because of trauma they experienced or because of how they were born. Maybe they were born in the wrong class. Maybe they were born neurodivergent, like me. I had more money than many there, but I also didn't go to a top-notch spa level rehab. I know there are people who have even more money than me who have totally recovered because of that access to resources. I have a dependency on marijuana that I'm trying to reduce, and I'm aware that I'm not totally where I ought to be, but I also know that going to rehab helped me a lot. And seeing so many other people at rehab who were kicked out, I won't go into any more detail about their stories because it really isn't my place. But the broader observation that they were kicked out because they didn't have money is something I don't think any of them would mind me bringing up. They were all frankly pissed about it. I'm sure they would be glad that I said, absolutely, this sucks. One of them, to actually bring this full circle, as he was being kicked out, I mentioned that I'm friends with Kevin Greutert, who directed Saw 6. And he's like, oh my God, that's the one where they put the health insurance executives on the carousel and then they execute them one by one. And I said, yes. And he's like, oh, I love that movie. And then he was walked to the door and sent back to his life as a drug addict. I had that brief moment of bonding with him over the fact that we both agree that Saw X has a point. Not Saw X, Saw and Saw X. They both have points.
They both have points. Pure, not advocating turning into Jigsaw, just saying they're about something. Matt, before you brought up your time in rehab, but before we get back to that, and I want to walk back a little bit to being neurodivergent. And obviously, we know that is a spectrum. I want to ask how you define yourself and what that means for how you see yourself in the context of a neurotypical world.
I have autism and attention deficit disorder. I struggle with both in different ways. Per the latter, I describe it as akin to trying to read a book outside during a windy day when the wind keeps turning pages against your will. That is a bit how it feels when your brain wanders against your own will. And gaining some level of control over your attention span is extremely difficult. I have found ways of mastering it. For example, often when I write, I will play a movie or loud music in the background. Some people would call that a distraction, but for me, it is a way of rechanneling that distractibility into something I can control. And thus, once I have it under control, I can then use the rest of my energy and focus on my work. Or to use the former as an example with autism, I frequently struggle with how to pick up on nonverbal cues. I've been told many times that I talk too much, that I am verbose, that I will go on and on about subjects that I find interesting without any sense of awareness about whether the person I'm talking to is also interested. And to compensate for that, I have now become self-conscious. I frequently apologize or solicit positive feedback, not because I'm needy, but because I sincerely don't know whether the other person is engaged. Does that clarify things?
Yeah, and you and I have had the conversation about what that means then for a person going into healthcare scenarios, what that means for someone talking to their doctor then, what that means within a system that is not really designed. Well, it's not really designed for any of us, but it's definitely not designed for neurodivergent people. Talk to me about what we've talked about the unique challenges then for someone like you going into
And
those healthcare scenarios.
I can give you a very specific example from that same rehab. There was a doctor who I will not name that I needed to see before leaving, before I checked out. By this point, I had cleared my dependency on benzos. That is what I needed to deal with. I felt that I was ready to go. The doctors felt I was ready to go. And as I was about to leave, I was told that this doctor wanted to speak to me. And I will never forget him saying that I was rude to him, that he had come to speak to me earlier, and I was very clipped, and I just wanted to leave right then and there, which is probably true, but I did not intend for this to be malicious at all. Sometimes when you are autistic, you are so fixated on your immediate objectives that you completely disregard the feelings of others. Again, not maliciously, not because we are hostile, but simply because we don't care. Which sounds almost worse, but it's the truth. And because I didn't coddle this man's feelings enough, he threatened to keep me there against my will, to extend my stay. And I did something very smart, and this is something I encourage anyone in that situation to do. I told him I was going to get my lawyer involved. And I am lucky that I have a lawyer to get involved. I'm lucky that I have those resources. I'm lucky that I knew that this was the right tactic to use. And thankfully, because of those two advantages that I had, which I would consider privileges, I was able to get out of that jam within an hour. He wasn't able to seriously harm me. There is one very important detail for context that the people listening to this need to know. My rehabs were all voluntary. I have never been involuntarily sent to rehab. I was there strictly as a patient. Therefore, if you are there strictly as a patient, they don't get to suddenly keep you involuntarily. That is not their call. If they ever lie to you about that, tell them you're getting a lawyer.
And Matt, you bring up something that is very important that I want to highlight, which is that we all, as patients, are very well conditioned from the time we are born to be compliant, to be
Yes.
agreeable and pleasant. One of my former guests actually mentioned that on her charts, she would see that it was noted that she was pleasant. And if you are not in a conforming, pleasant way with your healthcare team, there can be real consequences. And people who are neurodivergent may not be as pleasant and compliant.
And then we get penalized. And this happens everywhere in our lives. This has happened well beyond the healthcare sphere, where I would say it's particularly violating in the context of healthcare is that it's so cruel. That's a place where you need to be able to trust your doctor. It's a place where you need to be able to describe the most intimate details of your life and take for granted that you will receive a purely clinical response. I understand that doctors are human. I understand that a doctor may have a bad day. They may too need to be a little brusque. So I'm perfectly understanding of that, but they need to also be understanding of our humanity, especially the humanity of their neurodivergent patients. If you're talking about substance abuse, you're going to deal with a lot of neurodivergent patients.
Let's talk about that because you have been so candid in your writing about dealing with depression, dealing with substance abuse, and two things about that. The way that people who are neurodivergent may be uniquely vulnerable to some of these mental health issues, and also then the way that then it manifests and the way that they then have to seek help, the way that they have to navigate systems that may be very challenging. Talk to me a little bit about your own experience and your own understanding of what might make a neurodivergent person more vulnerable to depression, to addiction.
First, exactly what you said before, situations in which we are penalized simply for expressing ourselves in a way that feels natural and having that misinterpreted as malicious or hostile or disrespectful or inappropriate or in some other way out of line. That is number one. Number two is being, especially if you're a child, unable to get taken seriously even as an equal. There were many situations as a child wherein I appealed to healthcare providers for assistance and could instinctively tell that everything I told them was disregarded because I was a kid. That is exponentially worse if you're neurodivergent because there is an additional layer of communication difficulty. Not only are you not being treated as an equal because you're a child, but on top of that, you don't even know how to effectively communicate as an adult. Then, when you're talking about why so many of us are depressed, so many of us face addiction issues, it's because the societal intolerance is too much to bear. When I was in rehab, I knew so many people who had ADD, so many people who were autistic, so many people who had other neurodivergent conditions like Tourette or bipolar or even acute anxiety is considered by some, including myself, to be a neurodivergent condition. They don't know how to cope with a society, and so do I not know how to cope with a society that doesn't provide accommodations, where a neurotypical mind is viewed as right and everything else is viewed as wrong. Substances like alcohol and marijuana and benzodiazepines, in my case, and other people have different drugs of choice. Fentanyl is very popular in Pennsylvania, where I live. Crystal meth is also quite popular where I live. I have a prescription for Adderall, and I had one friend steal my pills. Adderall is a drug that I only take as prescribed because I am hyper by nature that if I used it beyond that level, I would explode. And I'm not being entirely figurative, but this one person stole my pills and used the some for himself and then stole others. It's very popular in this area. People find different ways to cope with how it is being rejected.
When you talk about that, we are now living in an era that is uniquely hostile to the neurodivergent. We are hearing people say, I can diagnose it. I can tell at an airport when I see a kid with autism. You have RFK Jr. saying this. You have an anti-vax movement that you've written about is using the Asperger's autistic neurodivergent community as an excuse against vaccines. What do you make of this, Matt?
I am simultaneously demoralized and a little inspired. And I'll start with why I say inspired, because that might seem incongruous. I'm noticing on both social and mainstream media, people overwhelmingly rejecting a lot of these observations. I would compare it to the Epstein scandal in that this is one of those situations where, unless you're a hardcore Donald Trump supporter, it appears most people see right through the baloney. And unless you're someone who was previously inclined to believe these conspiracy theories, or, like I said, you are partisan and therefore ride or die for Trump, the chances are you fall into the camp of the mainstream media and most people on social media and celebrities who roll their eyes about Trump when he and his supporters when they talk about autism, in a similar way to how they roll their eyes when Trump claims that he didn't know Jeffrey Epstein and he definitely is not a sex predator. People know deep down what the truth is, even if they are afraid to say it around the man himself. But where it's demoralizing, of course, and this is the bigger point, is that billions of dollars in research is being cut off. I recently interviewed President Trump's NIH director, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. And in that conversation, I tried, albeit in a way that I think may have been a bit too indirect, to mention how they pathologize autism. I was using the word pathologize as a catch-all to refer to everything from the anti-vaxxer rhetoric to the reductions or even eliminations in areas of research. And he talked about how he gave a very complicated response in terms of Trump's fiscal and health policy agenda. I encourage people to find the interview on reason.com and read it themselves. But what I would say is I believe this language only perpetuates harmful stereotypes. It treats autism as a disease, as something inherently disabling, rather than arguing that autism and other neurodivergent conditions are merely innocuous differences in neurobiology. And the reason it is bad, quote unquote, to be neurodivergent is because of social intolerance. In other words, it treats the issue of neurodivergency as pathological, which was the term I used when speaking to Bhattacharya, pathologize, when in fact it is political. And the solutions need to be achieved through legislative action, through political methods, through the neurodivergent community mobilizing as a group and asserting for its rights.
And I'm just going to say, I think one of the many things that scares me about this pathologizing is it implies that people who are neurodivergent can be fixed.
Yes.
And I really am very afraid then when I think of what the consequences are for children, for everyone who then can't be fixed, quote unquote, in a way that aligns with what neurotypical people want from them. That is one of my big concerns. And that brings me, I want to ask you one last question. You are, among other things, also an historian. When you look at this moment now and you look at how neurodivergent people are being treated and the rhetoric, what are you seeing with that bird's eye view? And what do you think the implications of this moment in history are for all of us, and particularly for people who are neurodivergent?
Thank you for asking that question. It's a question that I didn't even realize I very much want to answer. My answer to that question is that we should avoid the hyperbole of saying that they're going to round us up and send us to concentration camps. I've heard some people suggest that is counterproductive because it's so absurd that it distracts people from the more realistic concern, which is that they are going to completely cut away all social services that we need in order to survive. Healthcare services, welfare in terms of food stamps, which I know conservatives stigmatize for a number of reasons, any social security benefits that we receive, basically the financial and healthcare infrastructure that millions of neurodivergent people need to survive is going to be taken away. And when it is taken away, and when the culture in government is that you are sick and need to be cured, the inevitable consequence is when you don't get cured because you aren't, in fact, sick, you are sent to the most menial jobs in the workforce. You are given a life of abject wage poverty where you work a soul-crushing job and then go home to a miserable life where you die depressed and alone. This is not, by the way, a bird's eye view revelation. This is something I'm sure millions of neurodivergent people in their cores already know is in the offing for them. However, from a historian's perspective, this is what happens to any marginalized group. When you are on the outside, the goal of the elite is to make as much profit as they can, to extract as much value as possible from your labor within the confines of the status quo that benefits themselves, and then discard you. The status quo does not benefit neurodivergent people. Therefore, as long as we do not receive accommodations, we will be the victims of what some scholars refer to as extractive abandonment. There is a man whose first name eludes me. His last name is Chapman, and he wrote a book about neurodivergent politics that I encourage people to read. He coined the phrase extractive abandonment. And this is something that people who are neurodivergent, whether you're autistic, ADHD, bipolar, Tourette, acute anxiety, dyscalculia, dyslexia, whatever you have, you should be on the lookout for this particular dystopia. Don't worry about being in George Orwell. Worry about being in Franz Kafka.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm going to think about that. Matthew, I'm so grateful to you for your always honest, thoughtful responses, for your perspective. You are a voice for so many, and you have such a unique perspective. I'm always so grateful to talk to you. It's always a pleasure, even when it's a little scary. So
I do.
thank you for that, Matt. It's a joy, and we always have the Saw franchise, right?
We always will have Saw 6 until Donald Trump bans it.
Okay.
All right, I'll talk to you later.
Matthew, thank you so much. Have a
Yeah.
great rest of your day. Bye.
Bye.